The 1960s didn't just change music and politics. It completely rewired how terror crawls into your brain and stays there forever. Before CGI blood splatter and jump scare algorithms, filmmakers used shadows, silence, and your own imagination to break you. Some of these films were banned, some destroyed careers, and some created entire subgenres that still dominate horror today. Ready to discover the decade that invented modern fear? Spiderbaby, 1967. This is the film that made Charles Manson a fan, and honestly, that tells you everything you need to know about its twisted legacy. Director Jack Hill shot this deranged masterpiece in 1964, but no distributor would touch it for 3 years because they genuinely believed audiences would riot. The story follows the Mary family, whose children suffer from a fictional degenerative disease that causes them to mentally regress into murderous, cannibalistic creatures. Lon Chaney Jr. gives perhaps his most heartbreaking performance as the caretaker Bruno, desperately trying to protect these feral children from the outside world, while simultaneously protecting the world from them. What makes Spiderbaby genuinely horrifying is how it refuses to pick a tone. One moment you're laughing at absurdist black comedy. The next, you're watching a young woman gleefully trap a visitor in a web made of rope while wielding kitchen knives. Sid Haig, who would later become a horror icon through Rob Zombie's films, plays one of the murderous siblings with such childlike glee that you forget he's committing unspeakable acts. Critics at the time dismissed it as exploitation garbage, but modern horror scholars consider it the spiritual grandfather of films like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and House of 1,000 Corpses. The opening theme song, sung by Chaney himself, is simultaneously the catchiest and most disturbing musical number ever recorded for a horror film. Quentin Tarantino has repeatedly called it one of his favorite horror movies ever made. Onibaba, 1964. Japanese horror has always understood something Western filmmakers struggle with. True terror lives in the spaces between words, in what remains unseen, in the weight of guilt that hangs over every frame. Kaneto Shindo's Onibaba is a masterwork of psychological devastation set during 14th century Civil War Japan, where a mother and daughter-in-law survive by killing wounded samurai and selling their armor. Then, a neighbor returns from war, and jealousy and desire threaten to destroy everything. The demon mask at the center of this film has haunted viewers for 6 decades. When the mother steals a terrifying Hanya mask from a samurai to frighten her daughter-in-law away from their neighbor, she discovers the mask cannot be removed. The scene where it finally comes off, taking her face with it, remains one of horror cinema's most visceral practical effects. Shot entirely in tall Suzuki grass fields that sway and whisper like living things, Shindo creates an environment that feels both beautiful and suffocating. Cinematographer Kiyomi Kuroda won numerous awards for capturing moonlight in ways that make every shadow feel pregnant with threat. The film was controversial in Japan for its frank depiction of human desire and violence, but Western critics embraced it as proof that horror could be art. Martin Scorsese has cited it as a massive influence on his use of environment as character, and the mask imagery has been homaged in everything from video games to heavy metal album covers. Witchfinder General, 1968. Vincent Price called this the most difficult shoot of his career, and director Michael Reeves responded by delivering what many consider Price's greatest performance. Set during the English Civil War, Price plays Matthew Hopkins, a real historical figure who traveled the countryside, torturing and executing women accused of witchcraft. There's no supernatural element here. The true monster is humanity's capacity for cruelty dressed in religious righteousness, and Price plays Hopkins with a cold, businesslike efficiency that's far more terrifying than any demon. Michael Reeves was only 25 when he made this film, and he fought constantly with Price, who initially wanted to play Hopkins as a hammy villain. Reeves pushed him toward restraint, toward quiet menace, toward showing the banality of evil decades before Hannah Arendt's phrase became common cultural shorthand. The torture sequences caused censorship battles across multiple countries, with the British Board of Film Censors demanding extensive cuts that Reeves refused to make. Tragically, Reeves died from an accidental overdose just months after the film's release, leaving behind only 3 completed features: Critics who initially dismissed Witchfinder General as exploitation trash have completely reversed their opinions, now considering it one of the most important British horror films ever made. The influence stretches directly into folk horror classics like The Wicker Man and modern nightmare fuel like Midsummer. Price himself eventually admitted Reeves had been right about everything. Kill Baby Kill, 1966. Mario Bava invented more horror subgenres than any filmmaker in history, and Kill Baby Kill might be his most quietly influential achievement. Set in a Carpathian village haunted by the ghost of a murdered child, the film follows a forensic doctor investigating a series of impossible deaths where victims are found with coins embedded in their hearts. The imagery of a pale blonde girl bouncing a white ball through foggy streets has been directly stolen by approximately 1,000 horror films since. What separates Bava from his imitators is his painter's eye for color. Kill Baby Kill uses sickly greens, arterial reds, and suffocating purples to create a visual language where every frame tells you something is deeply wrong even before the horror begins. The famous spiral staircase sequence where the protagonist chases himself through endless rooms influenced both David Lynch and Federico Fellini. Critics at the time grouped Bava with schlock merchants, unable to see past the B-movie budgets and exploitation marketing. Now, he's studied in film schools worldwide as a master of visual storytelling on the level of any acclaimed auteur. Tim Burton has spoken extensively about how Bava's color palette shaped his entire aesthetic. The film was shot in 3 weeks for almost nothing, yet contains images that filmmakers with $100 million budgets still cannot match. That ghostly child has appeared in your nightmares even if you've never seen this film, because everyone she influenced put her there. Blood and Black Lace, 1964. This is the film that invented the slasher movie a full 14 years before Halloween and Friday the 13th. Mario Bava's Blood and Black Lace didn't just influence the genre, it created the entire template that every masked killer film has followed since. A faceless murderer in a black trench coat and featureless white mask stalks beautiful models through a fashion house, and Bava treats each killing as a twisted art installation. The fashion industry setting was revolutionary because it allowed Bava to justify his extravagant visual style while simultaneously critiquing the objectification built into that world. Each victim is framed like a magazine cover before their destruction, implicating the audience in ways that made contemporary critics deeply uncomfortable. American distributors barely released it, and it wasn't until home video that Blood and Black Lace found its massive cult following. John Carpenter has admitted to watching it repeatedly before shooting Halloween, and the fingerprints are impossible to miss. The masked killer, the stalking sequences, the creative dispatch methods, the beautiful victims who are more than they initially appear. Dario Argento essentially built his entire career by expanding on what Bava accomplished here. The film grossed almost nothing on initial release, but generated millions in influence, spawning the entire giallo subgenre that dominated Italian horror for 2 decades. That featureless mask has stared at you from countless movie posters since, and now you know where it came from. Peeping Tom, 1960. This film destroyed its director's career, got pulled from theaters within days, and was called the sickest movie ever made. Michael Powell had directed some of the most beloved British films in history, including The Red Shoes and A Matter of Life and Death. Peeping Tom ended everything. The story follows a camera operator who murders women while filming their terrified faces. And audiences in 1960 were not ready to confront the voyeurism that makes horror films possible. What makes Peeping Tom so enduringly disturbing is how it refuses to let viewers off the hook. Every time the killer films a victim, we're watching too. Every moment of terror we consume makes us complicit. Powell cast himself as the killer's father in home movie flashbacks, implicating filmmakers themselves in this cycle of watched violence. Critics at the time didn't just dislike the film, they actively campaigned for its destruction. One famously wrote that the only proper way to dispose of it was to flush it down a sewer. Powell never recovered professionally and spent the rest of his career in relative obscurity. Then, Martin Scorsese happened. Scorsese championed the film throughout the 70s and 80s, funding restoration efforts and convincing critics to re-watch with fresh eyes. Now, Peeping Tom is considered a masterpiece that was simply too ahead of its time, a brutal deconstruction of cinema spectatorship that remains more relevant than ever in our surveillance-obsessed culture. Eyes Without a Face, 1960. The French called this film poetic. The British called it disgusting. Both were completely right. Georges Franju's haunting nightmare follows a brilliant surgeon who kidnaps young women and surgically removes their faces in desperate attempts to restore his daughter's beauty after a car accident he caused. The daughter, played by Edith Scobb in a performance delivered almost entirely through her eyes while wearing a featureless white mask, has become one of horror cinema's most tragic figures. The face removal surgery sequence caused audience members to faint during initial screenings, which was remarkable because Franju shows almost nothing. The power lies entirely in sound design and suggestion, proving that imagination creates worse images than any special effect. The film was cut significantly for American release and retitled The Horror Chamber of Dr. Faustus, marketed as exploitation garbage when it's actually one of the most delicate horror films ever made. John Woo has cited the imagery as directly influencing his action films. Pedro Almodovar remade the story as The Skin I Live In. Billy Idol named a song after it. The mask Scobb wears has appeared in everything from fashion runways to music videos to Halloween costume shops, becoming a universal symbol of beauty, destroyed and desperately rebuilt. Critics who initially dismissed it as grotesque now consider Eyes Without a Face essential viewing for understanding how horror can function as poetry, as meditation, as art that refuses to look away from ugliness while somehow remaining beautiful. Carnival of Souls, 1962, made for $30,000 by an industrial film director from Kansas. Carnival of Souls should not exist. It should definitely not still be terrifying audiences 60 years later. Yet here we are, because director Herc Harvey accidentally created one of the most influential horror films ever made while essentially teaching himself how movies work. The story follows a woman who survives a car crash only to find herself drawn to an abandoned carnival pavilion, while ghoulish figures appear at the edges of her vision. Candice Hilligoss delivers a performance of such sustained dissociation that modern viewers often assume she's commenting on trauma and psychological fracturing. She wasn't. She was a relatively inexperienced actress doing her best with minimal rehearsal time and no budget for multiple takes. Sometimes limitation creates genius. The film's dreamlike pacing, achieved because Harvey couldn't afford coverage and had to let scenes breathe, directly influenced David Lynch's approach to horror. The ghouls were local theater actors in cheap makeup, yet their slow emergence from water and shadows has lost none of its power. George Romero watched Carnival of Souls repeatedly before making Night of the Living Dead. The entire ending, which recontextualizes everything you've watched, has been copied so many times that audiences often think they've predicted it when they've actually just absorbed it through cultural osmosis. The abandoned Saltaire Pavilion location has become a pilgrimage site for horror fans, though the building itself no longer exists. The Innocence, 1961. Henry James wrote The Turn of the Screw as an ambiguous ghost story, where you can never be certain if the supernatural events are real or imagined by an unreliable narrator. Director Jack Clayton and cinematographer Freddie Francis somehow translated that literary ambiguity into pure visual terror. Deborah Kerr plays a governess who arrives at a remote estate to care for 2 orphan children and becomes convinced the house is haunted by the spirits of former servants who corrupted the children before dying. What makes The Innocence so disturbing is how it refuses to confirm or deny anything. Are the children possessed? Is the governess experiencing a psychological break? The film provides evidence for both readings without ever committing. Francis won the Academy Award for cinematography on another film that year, but his work here is arguably superior, using deep focus to hide ghosts in plain sight throughout the frame. Viewers have reported seeing the spirits on rewatch in scenes where they swore nothing appeared the first time. Martin Scorsese has called it the best ghost film ever made. Guillermo del Toro considers it a masterclass in restraint. The scene where the ghost of Miss Jessel appears across a lake remains one of horror cinema's most beautiful and terrifying images simultaneously. The children's performances are so unnervingly knowing that rumors persisted for years about how Clayton achieved such results, though both actors have since discussed the perfectly normal production in interviews. Repulsion, 1965. Roman Polanski's London Nightmare remains the most accurate cinematic depiction of psychological deterioration ever filmed. Catherine Deneuve plays a young Belgian manicurist living in London whose fragile mental state completely collapses when her sister leaves for vacation, leaving her alone in their apartment. What follows is 70 minutes of walls cracking, hands emerging from surfaces, and reality disintegrating, while Deneuve's almost complete silence makes everything exponentially more unbearable. Polanski shot the film in actual London apartments, using wide-angle lenses to make small spaces feel simultaneously claustrophobic and infinite. The production design team literally widened hallways overnight to create the sense that the apartment was breathing, expanding, becoming a living organism. Deneuve has said she found the shoot genuinely disturbing, that Polanski kept her isolated from the crew to maintain her character's disconnection. Critics at Cannes gave it a standing ovation while simultaneously questioning whether it should have been made. The film established Polanski's apartment trilogy alongside Rosemary's Baby and The Tenant, 3 films exploring how domestic spaces can become prisons and predators. The scene where Carol sees her own reflection crack in a kettle just before everything truly falls apart has been studied in film schools as a masterclass in using everyday objects to generate dread. Deneuve won the first of many accolades for a performance delivered almost entirely through her eyes and the tension in her shoulders. Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, 1962. Hollywood legend says Bette Davis and Joan Crawford genuinely hated each other, and director Robert Aldrich captured that hatred on film while pretending to make a movie about sisters. Davis plays a former child star caring for her wheelchair-bound sister, a former Hollywood beauty, in their crumbling mansion. The care involves psychological torture, dead rats served for dinner, and one of the most disturbing performances Davis ever delivered. The behind-the-scenes warfare is as legendary as the film itself. Crawford allegedly put rocks in her pockets during the scene where Davis had to drag her, causing Davis back problems that persisted for years. Davis had Coca-Cola machines installed everywhere on set, purely because Crawford had connections to Pepsi through her husband. Aldrich encouraged the conflict, knowing it would generate exactly the toxic atmosphere his film required. Critics were divided, with some calling it camp trash, while others recognized the genuine terror of watching 2 icons dismantle each other and themselves. The film grossed over $9 million against a budget under $1 million, proving that audiences desperately wanted to see these women destroy each other. Davis received an Oscar nomination. Crawford, overlooked by the Academy, accepted the award on behalf of the winner, who couldn't attend just to walk the stage that night. The feud continued until Crawford's death. The film spawned the hagsploitation subgenre, where aging actresses were cast in horror films specifically to exploit anxiety about women and aging. The Haunting, 1963. Robert Wise refused to show a single ghost on screen, and somehow made the scariest haunted house film ever created. Based on Shirley Jackson's legendary novel, The Haunting of Hill House, the film follows a small group investigating a mansion with a reputation for unpleasantness. The house doesn't want them there. We know this because the house tells us through geometry, through sounds, through doors that breathe and walls that pulse. Wise had directed musicals, westerns, and science fiction, but nothing prepared him for what Jackson's story demanded. He and cinematographer Davis Bolton spent months developing techniques to make the architecture feel wrong, without anything overtly supernatural appearing. Ceilings are always in frame, pressing down. Corners never quite meet where they should. Sound echoes incorrectly. The famous door-breathing scene uses nothing but a physical effect, and Julie Harris's reaction, yet audiences have reported being unable to breathe themselves while watching. Stephen King considers it the greatest haunted house film ever made. Steven Spielberg watched it repeatedly before making Poltergeist. The 1999 remake proved exactly how badly things go when you show the ghosts and don't trust the source material. That remake cost $80 million and has been completely forgotten, while Wise's version remains required viewing. Julie Harris's Eleanor has become the definitive, unreliable horror protagonist, making you question whether the house is truly malevolent or simply reflecting her own psychological damage back at her. The Birds, 1963. Alfred Hitchcock spent 3 years developing technology that didn't exist to tell a story that made no sense, and the result traumatized multiple generations. The premise is simple. Birds suddenly begin attacking humans in a California coastal town. There is no explanation given. There is no resolution. There is only escalating terror until the screen goes dark and you're left staring at nothing, wondering why you ever trusted the sky. The technical challenges nearly broke Universal. Each attack sequence required combining live birds, mechanical birds, matte paintings, and sodium vapor, compositing in ways nobody had attempted before. Tippi Hedren, in her first major role, was told the climactic attic scene would use mechanical birds. It didn't. She spent 5 days being pelted with real birds while crew members threw them at her. One scratched her eye. She required a week of medical leave and has spoken about the trauma for decades since. Hitchcock allegedly said her exhausted breakdown was exactly what the scene needed. Critics at the time found the lack of explanation frustrating, expecting conventional narrative closure. Now that ambiguity is considered the film's greatest strength, a meditation on nature's fundamental indifference to human expectation. The sound design won Special Academy recognition despite receiving no traditional score. Bernard Herrmann's electronic bird sounds, created using early synthesizers, remain more disturbing than any orchestral assault could be. Night of the Living Dead, 1968. George Romero and his friends made this film over weekends for $114,000, and it changed everything about horror, independent filmmaking, and American cinema's willingness to confront race and social collapse. The story is deceptively simple. Dead bodies are reanimating and eating the living. Survivors hole up in a farmhouse. Nobody is safe. The ending destroys you completely, and Romero swore the casting of a black man as the hero was simply because Dwayne Jones gave the best audition. The result, whether intentional or not, created the most politically charged horror film of its era. The film opened the week Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and audiences walked out to headlines about American cities burning. The ending, where Ben survives the entire night, only to be shot by a posse of white men who don't bother to check if he's alive, hit different that week than Romero could have ever predicted. Critics dismissed it as exploitation nastiness. Audiences lined up around the block. Roger Ebert wrote about watching it with children in the audience who hadn't yet learned that horror films were supposed to end with survival and resolution. He described kids quietly crying, not from the zombies, but from the betrayal of narrative expectation. The film created the modern zombie entirely. Everything that shuffles and moans and hungers for flesh traces back to this farmhouse, these actors, and Romero's insistence that horror should hurt. Psycho, 1960. Alfred Hitchcock murdered his biggest star 47 minutes into the film and changed cinema permanently. Janet Leigh was the marketing. Janet Leigh was on every poster. Janet Leigh dies in a shower and never comes back. And audiences in 1960 had no framework for understanding what had just happened to them. Hitchcock bought every copy of Robert Bloch's novel he could find to prevent spoilers. He demanded theaters refuse entry after the film began. He broke every rule because he understood that rules exist specifically to make their violation devastating. The shower scene required 70 camera setups for 45 seconds of film. Chocolate syrup served as blood because it photographed better in black and white. Bernard Herrmann's shrieking violins weren't in the original plan. Hitchcock wanted the scene to play silent, but Herrmann recorded the cue anyway, and Hitchcock immediately recognized its genius. The scene has been analyzed more than any other sequence in film history. Every edit, every angle, every frame has generated academic papers and endless debate. Anthony Perkins created Norman Bates from nothing, giving one of horror's greatest monsters a boyish charm that makes his revelation genuinely shocking rather than simply gross. The film was considered borderline obscene by critics at the time. It grossed $60 million against an $800,000 budget. It proved that audiences wanted to be attacked, wanted to feel unsafe, wanted the contract between filmmaker and viewer completely shattered. every horror film made since exists in Psycho's shadow, whether it acknowledges this debt or not. The 1960s gave us horror that trusted audiences to sit with discomfort, that didn't explain everything, that let dread build through silence and shadows instead of constant noise. Which of these films haunts you most? Which ones do you think are overrated relics that modern horror has surpassed? Drop your hottest takes in the comments, because here's the real question. Did horror peak 60 years ago? Or have we just forgotten how to be genuinely afraid?